Compile is a name that we've seen a few times here on Bullet Heaven, and games like Space Megaforce, Blazing Lasers, and Power Strike 2, also known as Super Alesta, Gunhead, and Power Strike 2, have shown us that their tried and true shooting formula works. Especially, what was it called again? Right, Power Strike 2. But Alesta and Gunhead aren't all Compile gets its cred for. Take, for example, Gun-Nac, developed by Compile and published in Japan by Tonkin House in October 1990, with a North American release from Nexoft and ASCII in September 1991. Rumored that its name is a portmanteau of 1989's Gunhead and Compile's 1986 Famicom and 87 NES game Gun-Nac, Gun-Nac stands apart from all of Compile's other shooting games with its lighter, cute-em-up style visuals and interesting weapon set. Let's take a closer look. Ship control is easy enough. 8-way movement gets players to where they want to be in an efficient manner. If the player needs more or less speed, they can cycle through 4 speed levels using the select button, though the default speed is more or less adequate for the entire game. Pressing the B button will fire the player's main weapon, while the A button deploys a bomber. As we saw in Space Megaforce, Power Strike 2, and Gunhead, the main weapon system in Gun-Nac follows a very similar formula to most of Compile's shooting games. The player's main weapon starts off as your typical blaster, but can be changed or enhanced depending on a number of items that can be obtained throughout the game. Pickups are dropped by certain enemies or yellow Garbenzo or blue Lyman 3 item carriers, and they'll have different effects depending what they are. Players can expand their ship's power and defense by collecting a wing upgrade. The wing will instantly boost the player's weapon power by 1 level, and adds a layer of defense allowing the player to be hit once without dying. If the player is hit, the wing will be destroyed and their power will be decreased. Additional wings can be found throughout the game, and the player can only achieve the highest power levels in the game when one is equipped. Weapon pickups will have various numbers attached to them just as in any other Compile shooting game. Weapon 1 is the basic blaster. Weapon 2 is the Screen Buster, which fires heavy shots with sub-shots firing to the left and right as they travel down screen. Weapon 3 is the Homing Search Driver. Weapon 4 is the Awesome Dragon Napalm Flamethrower. Players should be careful with this weapon as its range decreases the longer it is fired. Players can stop firing to recharge its range. Finally, Weapon 5 is the Wide Beam Laser Cannon. These weapon pickups can be found throughout each stage, and a special blue type will cycle through all 5, giving players a strategic choice when found. Each of these weapons can be strengthened through 5 levels of increasing power in a few ways: a number of small power-up chips, a weapon of the same corresponding number, and a wing while wings are already equipped will boost the power level by 1 level. Bombers are a handy thing to have in tough situations. A stock of 4 bombers are granted to the player at game start, and additional bombers can be obtained, denoted by square icons bearing a letter. 1 extra bomber will be added to the player's stock for each one collected, to a maximum of 20 regardless of the letter that's on them. Like the main weapon, a blue cycling variant will also sometimes appear. There are 4 different types of bombers in Gun-Nac, and each behaves in a different manner. The Fire Bomber is indicated with an F and deploys in a localized circular manner. The Blizzard Bomber, or B, will deploy in a vertical column that sweeps slowly across the entire screen in a left and right manner. Thunder Bombers, or T, will sweep around the screen in a number of diagonal directions. Finally, the Water Bomber, or W, will deploy towards the top of the screen before raining down for a brief period of time. Here's the nifty thing about the bombers in Gun-Nac though. They can be leveled up to a maximum level of 4 by collecting additional bomber icons bearing the same letter as the one currently active. If the player collects a bomber of another type though, the level will be reduced to 1. The higher the level, the better, larger, or longer the effect will be when the bomber is deployed. Other drops also exist as well, including 1-ups, which appear as orange player ships, enemy erasers, which will clear the screen of most enemy types and their shots, and the often important money drops. These money drops can be spent between stages in the shop to equip the player's ship with a wing, a weapon of the player's choice, and upgrading the player's power level. Players can even drop bomber pickups in a later stage for preemptive assistance once that stage rolls around. With all of this taken into consideration, Gun-Nac plays very well, which is good because it's also a very lengthy game weighing in at 8 very long stages. These seemingly never-ending stages are once again typical of Compile, and an average playthrough of the game will clock in at close to an hour from start to finish, which in all honesty is a little much, but that's just how Compile do. But it's also a little on the easy side as well. A 1-credit clear isn't a difficult thing to accomplish at all in Gun-Nac, even for lower intermediate players. But shooting veterans are going to want to ratchet up the difficulty to see any real challenge here. As solid as it all is though, there are times that the limitations of the NES will cause a few problems, namely when it comes to flicker. There are quite a few times where sprites and enemy shots disappeared briefly, leading to a few cheap deaths, and the player respawn position is sometimes hard to see. To aid with this, players have an option to prioritize on-screen sprites rather than game speed, which should allow for greater visibility. All in all though, Gun-Nac is definitely one of the better playing NES shooters on the system, though its scoring does leave a bit to be desired. Generally speaking, Gun-Nac has a number of pretty generous extend scores which plays Compile's trademark jingle every time one is reached. Getting to these milestones is easy enough to do, and it can be achieved by taking three main factors into consideration. First up, simply blast away as many targets as possible. Knowing which weapon works best in a given situation will obviously lead to more efficient kills, and more points in the process. Second up, killing bosses and sub-bosses. In addition to regular enemy and ground target destruction, sub-bosses and stage-end bosses also contribute large amounts of points to the player's totals when defeated. Third point, pilfer as many power-ups and item drops as possible. Every pickup in the game will add to the player's score, but this will also mean switching weapons frequently. If players are only really comfortable with one certain weapon or bomber, they may not be able to capitalize on the many extra points they can offer. In some situations though, careful piloting can allow the player to collect all of the power-ups on screen, leaving just the desired weapon behind for collection last. There isn't much more to the scoring itself in Gun-Nac, but there are a couple of neat features that Compile has implemented to the game. For one, players will hear a unique jingle indicating that the high score has been surpassed. The default high score is only 80,000 points, so players should hear it in the first stage. This feature is great in a competitive setting. When game over does end up occurring, players will also see a screen that shows the current achieved score along with the highest score achieved. Once again, this is great for a competitive setting. But since there is no battery backup or save system like many PC Engine games of the same sort of style, and since Gun-Nac's game loops are a little extreme in length, taking a picture or grabbing a video capture are the best ways to archive these scores. All in all, it works, but the lack of a truly intricate scoring system and Gun-Nac's extreme length make the scoring aspect kind of secondary to the survival side of the game. Gun-Nac's presentation definitely has the kind of hallmarks that most Compile games exhibit, though players will get a more or less fleshed out plot depending on the version they play. The English manual is really something to behold though. It kind of reminds us of how Samurai Pizza Cat's localization was handled. With regards to its visuals, Gun-Nac is a pretty clean looking game. Most elements, such as enemies and their shots, are mostly visible despite the flicker that occurs to keep things moving at a super snappy rate. There are going to be some times where some hazards can be hidden by flicker, resulting in an unwanted collision. But once again, an option exists to prioritize sprites at the cost of game speed for better visibility. Each stage is visually distinct from the last, featuring varied, decently designed enemy types and unique sub- and stage-end bosses throughout the game. While some are better designed than others, the Stage 1 Rabbit boss with its paw print craters and the Stage 5 Lucky Cat sub-boss are far and away our favorites. They all work within Gun-Nac's parodic setting. The shop screen also stands out with its very distinct portrait for the shopkeeper surrounded by ordnance of all types. On the sound front though, things are less solid. Compile's soundtracks can be hit or miss. We really like the soundtracks from games like Musha Alesta and Power Strike 2, and while its sound is a bit too poorly programmed, we do in fact think Space Megaforce's compositions are great. But we aren't really fans of the music in Gun-Nac, Gunhead, or Guardian Legend. Gun-Nac falls in the middle somewhere. Most of the BGM starts out really good, but often devolves into annoying pieces that lack the kind of progression their intros deserve. Most of the pieces here are probably striving to capture a whimsical tone, but it ends up being a little annoying. It's a style I just don't like. Meanwhile, most of the effects used throughout the game are fine, but there are some like the laser and water bomber that get a little on the irritating side too. Rounding out the presentation is a simple menu that features tweaks for the game's difficulty and performance, as well as a sound test. Neat. So, how does Gun-Nac stack up? Let's take a look. Gun-Nac controls extremely well, all while running at a buttery 60 frames per second, even in crowded screens. Gun-Nac isn't an especially hard game, but novices will be decently challenged. Veterans will need to boost the difficulty though. Gun-Nac has 8 stages that kind of go on forever. To be frank, it overstates its welcome just a bit. The ultra-fast, responsive gameplay in Gun-Nac is impressive given the size and number of the sprites employed, but some of the flicker will hide certain hazards. All of the enemies are well designed though. Most of the sound effects are pretty good, and the music starts off decently in most of the pieces in the game, but the soundtrack goes off the rails in directions I really don't like. There are also a few grating effects here and there. While most of the aspects of Gun-Nac are also present in like every other compile shooting game ever, the shop system is a great addition. Meanwhile, the bomber power-up system is also pretty neat, and that flamethrower weapon? Mwah! Hell yes! NES copies of Gun-Nac are fairly rare, and their current prices seem to reflect this. Even loose copies are far more expensive than this game is worth to own physically. Thankfully, Japanese copies, especially loose ones, are much more manageable, but still pretty expensive in their own right. Believe it or not, we've been sitting on Gun-Nac for review for over 10 years. It's a game that we've been able to 1cc on stream at least once, and we do enjoy firing it up every now and again. I may not like a lot of the music, but the gameplay is definitely of a great caliber. It could be time to look into others like Xanac, or Xanac Cross Xanac, or Musha Alesta. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Gun-Nac gets a 4.5 out of 5. It's pricey, but if a physical copy of Gun-Nac is something you crave, particularly for the NES, it can be had at auction for a ton of cash. Well, that does it for 2020. We're getting back on track now by starting 2021 with what was supposed to be for episode 288, Darius Cosmic Collection Arcade and Console. Yes, really this time. We also hope to have all kinds of new random plays, including but not limited to Task Force Campus, Vitamin Connection, ADK Tamashi, Shadowgate, Panzer Dragoon Remake, and more. We'll see you all in the new year. Until then, fuck 2020. Peace.